The Gradual Path as a Hermeneutical Approach to the Dhamma. George D. Bond. Theravada Buddhism, from an early period, placed the Tipitaka at the center of the tradition, regarding it as the word of the Buddha, Buddhavacana, Fef, and even as the Dharmakaya. 1. With the Tipitaka occupying the central place, hermeneutical questions concerning the interpretation of the canon took on great importance for Theravada, and as a result, many of the distinctive doctrines and ideas of Theravada developed in the commentaries and sub-commentaries to the Tipitaka. As I have noted elsewhere, the commentarial writings represented Theravada's second and final solution to the problem of how to interpret and understand the Tipitaka. Theravada's first solution to the problem of interpretation is found, however, in two post-canonical texts, the Netipakararo and the Petakopadesa. These two works set forth an approach to the interpretation of the Tipitaka, a hermeneutical method and viewpoint that shaped Theravada's thinking on these matters and profoundly influenced the commentarial tradition. Traditionally attributed to Mahakachana, both the Neti and the Petakopadesa represent complex, highly technical manuals of interpretation. Although these two works are not identical, they present the same views and the same method of interpretation. 3. Both the Neti and the Petakopadesa develop the notion of the gradual path to Nibbana and employ it as a hermeneutical strategy for explaining the Dhamma. Although the notion of a gradual path became common in later Buddhism, both in Theravada and Mahayana, and came to represent the hallmark of the Theravada tradition through works such as the Visuddhimagga, the idea does not seem to have been explicitly worked out in Theravada texts prior to the Neti and Petakopadesa. How then did these texts come to state it so forcefully and in such detail? Could the context in which these two texts arose have shaped and necessitated this hermeneutical viewpoint? We shall begin by considering this second question, for it will enable us to see both the significance and the meaning of the hermeneutical strategy of these texts. In his recent book, Selfless Persons, Stephen Collins has endorsed the notion that Theravada texts should be understood against the backdrop of their context. He writes, Theravada thinking has arisen from the historical and cultural context, and it embodies certain constructions and hypotheses which are addressed to quite specific and socially derived concerns. 4. The text can be understood, he argues, in Durkheim's sense as social facts. 5. Collins's views regarding the relation between Theravada texts and their contexts bear out the opinions of other scholars on the question of the relation between a text and its context. Without digressing too far into this broader subject, we can summarize this research by saying that context seems to function on at least two levels to shape the process of text production and interpretation in a cumulative religious tradition. First, contexts generate texts. This truth has been long accepted in biblical studies, where it represents the basis for form criticism and other approaches to understanding the text. Other scholars such as Mary Douglas have also shown that the beliefs and values that constitute a person or group's cosmology both are shaped by and reciprocally reshape the context. 6. A social context establishes a cost structure and a pattern of rewards and punishments. It permits or requires certain value systems and interpretations of the meaning of existence, and at the same time, it renders implausible other values and interpretations. By its constraining influence upon belief, each context generates a particular cultural or cosmological bias, a collective moral consciousness about man and his place in the universe. 7. Since texts represent frozen cosmologies, we can see that texts also arise subject to the constraints of a context and represent that context. The second point to note is that just as the context permits certain cosmologies as plausible and prevents others as implausible, so the context also permits certain interpretations of texts and prevents others. As W. Cantwell Smith has shown, religious texts, as part of the cumulative tradition that comes down from the past, confront the individual of faith, but the individual has to interpret the text in a way that gives it meaning and plausibility in his context. 8. The context strongly influences the decisions people make about how to understand a text. Which ideas should a people take up and emphasize, and which ideas should they leave aside? The Neti and the Petakopadesa seem both to have arisen in and to reflect a specific historical context that shaped their understanding of the Dhamma. Both texts seem to represent what Collins calls social facts in this sense. The danger, of course, in speculating about the social context behind Buddhist texts is that since we can never be entirely sure, the project remains somewhat speculative. We cannot be certain about all the details of the ancient Indian context in which the Neti and the Pithakopadesa emerged. There is, however, a general scholarly consensus about the nature of the Indian context and the place of religion in it, and the picture painted by this consensus sheds important light on the backgrounds and intentions of our texts. Louis Dumont has described the Indian context as having had two kinds of people: those that live in the world and those that have renounced it. 9. Those who lived according to the norms of the caste system and the village he describes as men of the world, and those who went to the forest he styles renouncers. 10. This basic depiction of ancient Indian society agrees with Weber's view of the dichotomy between ordinary people and virtuosos. 11. Dumont goes on to argue that the religious thought of this period must be understood in relation to these two types of persons. 12. The renouncer has an individualistic religion, while the men in the world do not see themselves individualistically, and thus have group-oriented religious ideas. Louis de la Vallée-Poussin also depicted the Indian context in this way, and explained how Indian religions express this context. The ancient India, he observed, generated two kinds of religious traditions, one kind suited for the renouncer, the individuals, and another kind suited for the men in the world. The former kind he termed disciplines of salvation, and the latter kind, religions. The religions, properly so called, were characterized by the provisions they made to meet the needs of the people living in society. Religions provided prayers, rituals, sacrifices, deities, and sacraments that addressed both the immediate and ultimate needs of these people. By setting forth moral guidelines, the religions adjusted the sacred to the secular, thereby sanctioning life in the world. By holding funeral rituals, they provided for the welfare of the dead and the afterlife. 14. The religions supplied the kind of hierarchical cosmology needed by people living in a group-dominated society. The disciplines of salvation, however, had none of these group cosmology characteristics. Disciplines of salvation were neither philosophies nor religions, but paths, marga, leading to liberation, moksha, or nirvana. Supramundane rather than mundane ends represented the focus of the disciplines of salvation. No provisions were made for mariage, funerals, or even for social interaction, since the disciplines were intended for those who had renounced secular life in society. It was as such a discipline of salvation that early Buddhism began, Poussin explained. Poussin's view of the ancient Indian context and the place of Buddhism in it also resembles that of Max Weber. Weber described early Buddhism as an asocial system of radical salvation striving that set out a path for those ascetics who had fled the world, but had little to offer to people who remained in the world. 15. He compared the role of the laity in Buddhism to that of the tolerated infidels in Islam, who existed only for the purpose of sustaining by alms those who sought the true goal of the religion. 16. That early Buddhism represented a discipline of salvation seems fairly probable. The Buddha and his early disciples were part of a wider movement of samarsas, or world renouncers, in ancient India. Many Buddhist suttas and teachings reflect the individualistic cosmology and liberation-seeking characteristic of Poussin's disciplines of salvation. If, as Poussin believed, early Buddhism began as a discipline for renouncers, it seems clear that it soon had to come to terms with the needs of men in the world. As Buddhism developed, it necessarily began to establish relations with the society in which the men in the world lived. Dumont has commented on this process of development in Indian religions, saying that the secret of Hinduism may be found in the dialogue between the renouncer and the man in the world. 18. Change occurred, and the Hindu religious tradition evolved because the renouncers, who were the agents of development in Indian religion and speculation, the creators of values, had to address themselves to the larger society. 19. Again, Dumont writes, the true historical development of Hinduism is in the sannyasic developments on the one hand, and their aggregation to worldly religion on the other. 20. For Buddhism also, the interaction between these two contexts and two cosmologies served as the catalyst for developments that shaped the religion. One of the major problems that Buddhism faced as it spread in India and elsewhere was the necessity of validating the role of the man in the world, of meeting the social or religious needs of non-renouncers. This clash of contexts appears to have been the setting in which both the Neti and the Pithakopadesa originated. More clearly, perhaps, than any other early Theravada texts. These two texts reflect this process of development in the Theravada tradition and the formulation of Theravada's distinctive viewpoint. Both the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa AC acknowledge the two ideal types, the renouncers and the men in the world, and attempt to explain the Dhamma in relation to them. The method of interpretation and the hermeneutical viewpoint of these texts appear to have been developed in response to the problem of finding a way of addressing the religious concerns of people with quite different needs, and yet retaining the central notion that the Dhamma had one truth and led to one goal, nibbana. The Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa responded to this contextual dilemma by positing the gradual path to nibbana as a hermeneutical device that enabled them to reconcile the differing cosmologies and ideals under the umbrella of the unitary truth of the Dhamma. The notion of the gradual path to nibbana allowed the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa to subsume mundane goals under the supramundane goal and to explain how the truth of the Dhamma relates to all people. In developing the gradual path as a hermeneutical strategy, Theravada followed the same pattern that Dumont perceives in Hinduism. The doctrine of transmigration, Dumont observes, establishes the relation between the renouncer as an individual man and the phantom-like men who have remained in the world and support him. 21. Transmigration appears as a bold design lending to the men in the world some reality taken from that which the renouncer has found for himself. 22. The Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa employ the gradual path similarly. They use it as a way of viewing transmigration as what Collins terms a soteriological strategy. 23. With which the doctrines of Buddhism relate to the two major contexts, and all shades of context in between. Collins explains that in correlating these two contexts, Theravada developed an intermediate range of thought and practice, such that certain symbols from the disciplines came to be used for goals usually associated with the religions. 24. As manuals of interpretation, the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa present the gradual path as a key that unlocks the meaning of the Buddha's Dhamma. The Neti describes the nature of the Dhamma by citing a saying attributed to the Buddha. 0 bhikkhus, I shall teach you a Dhamma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with its own meaning and phrasing. Number 5. Majjhima Nikaya 3.280. The complexity of this Dhamma was increased, the Neti maintains, by the fact that the Buddha's teaching was unbounded or immeasurable. Aparimirza. Number 8. These descriptions point up the uniqueness of the Dhamma. As the Buddha set it forth, it was supreme, unbounded truth with its own inherent structure and logic. To comprehend the Dhamma, an interpreter must penetrate this logic and grasp the meaning and phrasing of the Dhamma properly. As the Anguttara Nikaya points out, incorrectly interpreting the meaning and phrasing of the Dhamma leads to the breakup and destruction of the Dhamma. 2.147. Both the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa assume that the internal logic and structure of the Dhamma derive from the gradual path. The gradual path expresses the Dhamma's goodness in the beginning, middle, and end. It is through the concept of a gradual path, these manuals say, that the Buddha related the ultimate end to all people. All the elements of the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa's method, including the meaning and phrasing elements, function within the framework of this gradual path. By superimposing the pattern of the gradual path onto the Dhamma, these two texts find the hierarchy of means and ends necessary to relate the Dhamma to a variety of people and yet to maintain the belief in one ultimate goal and one ultimate meaning of the Dhamma. To delineate the logic and structure of the gradual path and the integral nature of this path to the Buddha's Dhamma, the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa set forth classifications of types of persons to whom the Buddha addressed his teachings and types of suttas that the Buddha employed to reach these persons. These typologies are presented in the chapter in each text entitled The Foundation of the Sisana, which indicates the central importance that the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa assigned to them. An interpreter who approached the Dhamma without being aware of these distinctions could not comprehend the Dhamma, and would be in danger, the Pe-Takopadesa declares, of mixing ilpi the suttas. p. 80. In classifying the various types of persons to whom the Buddha directed his teaching, our texts posit the two basic contextual types that parallel those Dumont has suggested. However, these texts present a somewhat more complex description of those types. The base classification given divides persons into three types: the ordinary person, Putujana, the learner or initiate, Seka, and the adept, Aseka, P._42, N.49. These classifications represent levels on the path, from beginner to arahant. The first two types clearly represent men in the world and are renouncers, respectively. The third type elaborates on the category of renouncers by adding to those who are on the way, Sekas, those who have reached the goal, Asekas. These two groups can be called those who are being purified, and those who have reached purification, N2. In addition to these levels of persons, the texts also classify persons according to their nature or temperament, karita, and their abilities. Reflecting the Buddhist doctrines of karma and sarpdatsara, this classification scheme assumes that persons at each level of the path may have varying needs, propensities, and abilities. Although the texts SG has several classifications of temperaments, the basic one employed D1V1D's people into two groups: persons of desire temperament, Tat Hi Karita, and persons of view temperament, D T Tikarita, N. 109. A person's temperament determines what kind of defilements the person will have. For example, the view temperament person will have ignorance as a delement, while the desire temperament person will be defiled by Kravamji, N. 109. Temperament also determines how people seek release unsuccessfully, for example, by asceticism in the case of the view temperament person, and by the pursuit of sensual pleasures in the case of A, person of desire temperament, p. 242. Other temperament classifications are suggested at Venus palms from the manuals, but all classifications are said to be reducible to the view, temperament and desire temperament types, N. 126. Another classification posits the three types of lusting temperament, Riga Karita, hating temperament, Dosa Karita, and deluded temperament, Mohar Karita, N. 190. Employing a different criterion, still another classification divides persons into the three types of those who gain knowledge from a condensed or brief teaching, Ugatitailai, those who gain knowledge from a teaching that is expanded, Vipaisitafiai, and those who are merely or barely guidable, Araya, and 7. These classifications of persons are at times multiplied by qualifying the basic types with adjectives such as dull-facultied or bright-facultied. Correlated with these types of persons, the Neti and the Pe-Takopadesa identify various types of suttas. These typologies of suttas also indicate the nature of the gradual path in the Dhamma. Both texts posit four basic types of suttas that represent the foundation of the Saisana. The four types include suttas dealing with defilement, SA1J Kalesa, suttas dealing with moral living, Visanyi, suttas dealing with penetration, Nibbedha, and suttas dealing with the adept, Aseka. This classification of suttas is said to be increased from 4 to 8 in the nets and to 16 in the Pe-Takopadesa because of various combinations of these four basic types. These sutta types clearly reflect the two major contexts suggested by Dumont, and also the two types of religion described by Poussin. The two primary types of suttas are those dealing with morality and those dealing with penetration, which correspond to the religion of the man in the world and the discipline of the renouncers, respectively. At one point, the Neti suggests that these two types of suttas are the only two kinds, N.48, and the Pe-Takopadesa defines the two primary types of suttas as those dealing with previous devotion and those dealing with penetration, P.42. By expanding these two basic types to 4, these manuals indicate the outlines of the gradual path. The type of sutta dealing with defilement, SA1JLKILESA, describes the sufferings persons endure from life to life because of wrong desires and wrong actions. In the foundation of the Sasana section, the Neti illustrates this type of sutta with short quotations, such as the first verse of the Dhammapada. If a person speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows him just as the wheelfoal loads the hoof of the ox. N. 129. Other examples show that suttas of this type have as their subject the predicament of the unenlightened person. Ignorance and desire lead astray the people described or admonished by this type of sutta. This is the negative side of the life of the man in the world. The positive side of the life of the man in the world is covered by the type of sutta dealing with the morality appropriate to one living in the world, Visani. The Neti explains that these suttas concern merit George D. Bond, Puyatart, and the way to earn a favorable rebirth, N.48f. Under this category of sutta, The neti lists the traditional components of the merit-making ritual system in Theravada: giving, dana, virtue, sila, and heaven as a goal for rebirth, saga. N49. Suttas dealing with morality do not provide instruction about the higher stages of the path, but have to do with virtue as restraint and the rewards of good karma. N.49, 159. The examples given of this type of sutta describe the progress that people made toward the goal as a result of virtuous acts and favorable rebirths. One such example cites the story of a man who gave a flower garland to the Buddha and, as a consequence, the Buddha told Ananda that the man would have good rebirths for 84,000 eons, whence, after fulfilling roles as a king and a deva, he would go forth as a monk to find the truth. No 138 Farzers. Other examples of suttas of this type mention similar meritorious acts, such as giving 4 flowers or a meah shore of rice that resulted in thousands of delightful rebirths. One sutta declares, "Today these 30 eons have passed after my meritorious act, and since then I have not been to a bad destination." The 141. Clearly, this classification of suttas sanctions rebirth as an acceptable goal for people in the world. By doing meritorious deeds, a person is assured of a good destination. Favorable rebirths are seen not as ends in themselves, however, but as stages on the path, stepping stones to a birth in which a person is able to strive for the ultimate goal. The sutta passages cited in the neti, many of which cannot be traced in the canon, make it clear that rebirth in good destinations represents a penultimate, not an ultimate goal. One passage, for instance, tells of a man who gave a gift of robes to a Pachaka Buddha and was reborn in various heavenly realms until finally being reborn as the son of a wealthy banker in Varanasi. In that lifetime, he encountered the Buddha and went forth to find enlightenment. Fortunate births neither represent nor replace the supreme goal, but they constitute a hierarchy of sub-goals of the kind needed by persons in the world. Far from being irrelevant or unnecessary for the attainment of nibbana, these births represent necessary stages on the path of purification and development. 143. In this way, the suttas on morality provide for the kind of active, devotional religion that Pusan attributes to the village dweller. Sharply contrasted with the suttas on morality are the suttas on penetration. Where morality suttas deal with merit, penetration suttas deal with the fruit of the noble path, or the supreme goal of nibbana. N48. Where morality suttas describe virtue as restraint, penetration suttas describe virtue as abandoning. Where morality suttas have no reference to wisdom, the noble path, and the noble fruit, these subjects are central in penetration suttas. N49. Although suttas on morality that set forth the ideal of merit-making are said to present the first kind of striving, a gradual path as a hermeneutical approach. Padhina. The suttas on penetration present the higher striving of going forth from home to homelessness. N.159 F.E. In the examples of this kind of sutta given by the neti, penetration clearly represents a discipline of salvation for renouncers. These suttas teach a path for forest dwellers and rag-robe wearers who have abandoned world. Why matters? N.145. Although the neti and the Pe.Takopadesa are not adamant on the point, they represent the renouncers in the penetration type as bhikkhus. They do not say that no lay persons can pursue this path, but at the same time they do not cite any examples of this type of sutta that refer to lay persons. The Pe.Takopadesa refers to the path of these suttas as the 4 noble planes and 4 noble fruits of the bhikkhu's state. P.130. The authors appear to have understood the tasks of penetration to be monastic tasks, whereas the tasks of morality were primarily tasks of the laity. The suttas that the Heti cites to exemplify this type do not concern the kind of legalistic monastic discipline such as is given in the Vinaya Pitildetaka with its minor rules of conduct. But instead, these suttas have to do with the higher monastic discipline of conquering the ego and the emotions in order to progress in meditation. Penetration suttas refer, for example, to a mindful bhikkhu who abandons lust for sensual desires, N.146, and to bhikkhus who are liberated. Suttas that describe how one eliminates desire hatred and other defilements are suttas of the penetration type tilde, N.145. In the penetration suttas, beings are described and instructed regarding crossing the flood and attaining liberation from becoming. The fourth type of sutta, that dealing with the adept, completes the progression from ordinary persons to liberated individuals by describing the fully enlightened arahant. Suttas in this category deal with the saints who have conquered defilements and live in mindfulness and self-control. N150. The goal of Buddhism constitutes the subject of these suttas. The Heti illustrates this type of sutta by citing passages from the Udina that describe one who is a Brahmin in the Buddhist sense of a holy person. 150. UD 6. Such persons have attained equanimity and transcended rebirth in form or formlessness, as well as both pain and pleasure. The Neti shows that adepts such as Mogaraja have exhausted the Isavas, display the threefold wisdom, Tivija, and Miracle Laos powers, and bear their last body, Nam 152. In addition to this fourfold classification of suttas, the Neti and the Takopadesa both offer further classifications of suttas. They explain that the fourfold scheme can be expanded to 5 by dividing the penetration type into 2. Suttas on seeing, Dasarya, and suttas on developing, Bhavani, p. 39 and 168. Suttas on seeing are shown to describe the stream enterer's path, whereas suttas on developing deal with the other 3 noble paths. Our texts also propose a second classification Shi that revolves around 2 basic types, which are mundane suttas, Lokska, and supramundane suttas, Lokuttara, p. 23 and 162. This scheme, however, is put forward not to identify other different types of suts, but as an alternate way of classifying the 4 basic types. Suttas dealing with corruption and with morality are classified as mundane, while suttas on penetration and the adept come under the supramundane category. The other types in the Heti's second list of classifications function similarly as alternate ways of categorizing the basic sutta types, for example as suttas on beings, sati, or suttas on ideas, dhammas, suttas on knowledge, and suttas on the profitable, kusala, or the unprofitable, akusala, Nub 161. 25. The Takopadesa offers 2 additional schemes for classed 5G suttas, comprising some 13 and 28 types respectively. Although these schemes present different perspectives on the suttas, such as suttas on karma and suttas on results, vipaka, or suttas on gratifica the Takopadesation, asarya, and suttas on disadvantage, idvnava, explains that all these types also represent only variations or expressions of the 4, now 5, basic types, page 42. Having explained these 4 or 5 types of suttas and underscore their variations, the Heti and the Takopadesa indicate another sense M, which the stages represented by the different types constitute a gradual path. Each type of sutta is said to counteract the stage that precedes 1T, suttas on morality, counteract suttas on defilement, suttas on seeing county, act suttas on morality, suttas on developing counteract suttas on CMG, and suttas on the adept counteract suttas on developing, N. 189. The types of suttas are said to represent a definite progression from defilement to enlightenment. The most comprehensive picture of the progression of stages on the gradual path emerges, however, when the manuals indicate how these various types of suttas apply to the different levels and types of persons. By multiplying suttas by the levels and personality types, the manuals present an elaborately elongated gradual path. The basic correlatio, of course, is that between the 5 sutta types and the 3 levels of BMGs. Ordinary persons, learners, and adepts. The defilement and morality type of suttas apply to ordinary persons. The Simji and develop MG types to the learners, and suttas on the adept have their obvious afka chan. This process of correlation becomes more complex in the hets when the sutta types are applied to personality types. N. 189 pounds. There, the mundane suttas, which comprise the defilement and morality types, are demonstrated by 19 types of temperaments, all derivations of the lusting, hating, and deluded types. Similarly, the supramundane suttas are demonstrated by 26 types of learners and adepts. N. 189f. Gradual path as a hermeneutical approach. The Pitakapadesi's equation of suttas and persons, however, goes even beyond the Hetty's calculations to display the complete gradual path. This path begins with the defilement suttas that have reference to persons defiled by craving temperament, view temperament, or misconduct, page 29. In the morality suttas, instructions are given that indicate how persons of these types overcome their defilements. The trances or jhanas of samadhi meditation can be employed by these persons to overcome defilements such as lusting, hating, and delusion. Page 144. When, through making merit and through jhanas, these persons gain a foothold in the Dhamma and enter the path, the supramundane stage, they lose their defilements but retain their distinctive characters. The person of desire temperament becomes a follower by faith, sadhinusiri, and the view temperament person becomes a follower by dhammas, dhamminusirts, p. 243, n. 112. These attainments shape their further incarnations on the path. At the penetration sutta stage, the follower by dhammas becomes one who gains knowledge by condensed teaching, oga-tittai, and the follower by faith becomes one who is merely guidable, entayo. The third epistemological type, the one who learns from an expanded teaching, vipansitayai, results when the two previous knowledge types are divided further according to whether they possess dull or keen faculties. The ones who learn from a condensed teaching and have dull faculties, and those who are guidable with keen faculties, constitute the third or expanded teaching type, p. 30. From this point on, these three knowledge types dominate the Pitakapadesa's explanation of the path. In suttas describing the plane of seeing, these three types attain different levels of stream entry. The condensed teaching person becomes a single-seater, ekabiphan, the most advanced kind of stream enterer. The guidable person becomes a clan-to-clan, kolarakola, and the learner by expanded teaching becomes a 7 times at most, a stream enterer who requires the maximum time to complete the path. At the higher levels, these variations in attainments continue. The single-seater becomes either a non-returner who attains release early, or a non-returner who attains release only after reducing the time of rebirth. The expanded teaching type also takes one of 2 different forms of non-returner, while the guidable person becomes a non-returner who goes upstream to the Akanitha gods. Finally, at the level of the Arahant, these 3 knowledge types evolve into 9 kinds of Arahants. The evolution of these is described below. Condensed with keen faculties becomes 2 kinds. Both ways liberated, ubhato bhigavimuto, liberated by wisdom, bhaitya-vimuto. Condensed with dull faculties becomes 2. Waiting for an eon, titakap, penetrator, pativadhana piva. Expanded with keen faculties becomes 2. Able by choice, Sitani Baba. Able by guarding, Rakarzi Baba. Expanded with dull faculties becomes 2. No, liberation attainer. If he seeks it, liberation attainer if he does not seek it. No liberation attainer if he guards it. Liberation attainer if he does not guard it. Guidable becomes 1 liable to fall away or an even-headed 26. Thus, by illustrating the various combinations of suttas, levels, and personality types, the Takapadesa is able to depict the length and diversity of the gradual path. This formulation of the path has lengthened it significantly from the earlier notion of the 4 noble persons as the only higher stages. This understanding of the gradual path as the basic structure of the Buddha's Dhamma also provides the rationale for the other elements in the method of interpretation presented by the Neti and the Takapadesa. 27. The neti identifies the two concerns of interpretation as meaning, atta, and phrasing, bi.jnana, and of 5. To deal with these two concerns, the other two main sections of the neti and the Pithakopadesa, in addition to the foundation of the sasana, present specific guidelines for interpreting the suttas. 28. The Nai or meaning guidelines demonstrate 3 ways that suttas counteract defilements with profitable states and move people toward the meaning or goal, atta, of the Dhamma. These meaning guidelines are intended to show interpreters how the 18 root terms 29 encode the meaning of the Dhamma and relate it to specific types of persons. This interpretive task can also be seen as another explanation of the way that the suttas address and counteract the defilements of persons at the lower levels of the path. The types of persons that are the subjects of the guidelines are those that we have seen on the level of ordinary persons and in mundane suttas. The first meaning guideline, conversion of relishing, nandiyavata, concerns the desire temperament and the view temperament types of persons. This guideline demonstrates how desire and ignorance, the two unprofitable root terms at work in these types, are counteracted in the suttas by 2 profitable root terms, concentration, samita, and insight, vipassani. N.11 of. The neti intends to teach the interpreter to recognize the dynamic at work here in order to understand and apply the Dhamma properly. The second meaning guideline, lion's play, stavik lidatafel, correlates 4 unprofitable and profitable root terms with 4 temperament types, lusting, hating, dull view temperament, and intelligent view temperament. N. 118. The final meaning guideline reintroduces the 3 knowledge types of persons, see above, and indicates how the suttas relate profitable root terms to counteract the unprofitable ones associated with these types. These profitable and unprofitable root terms in all 3 guidelines represent the essence of the Dhamma, and the guidelines provide further explanations of how this essence is expressed in the suttas in various ways to fit various persons. The remaining major element in the method of interpretation of the neti and the Pithakopadesa takes the phrasing of the suttas and demonstrates the unity beneath the diversity. The Hayiri or phrasing categories are 16 different ways of analyzing suttas in order to recognize that their meaning is one and only the phrasing is different. The purpose of these categories is to teach the interpreter how to analyze suttas in order to reduce them to their prime factors. The manuals establish an outline of these prime factors or ideas that constitute the heart of the Dhamma. Among the ideas included in this outline are the 4 noble truths: dependent origination, aggregates, elements, bases, and faculties, in 21F, 63F, P98F. Regarding this outline, the Pithakopadesa explains that there is no sutta of any kind that is not in accord with these ideas, P98. Thus, the Hiri interpret the logic of the suttas by providing an understanding of the basic presuppositions and intentions of the Dhamma. These Hiri also reveal how the Buddha applied various teachings to var-ayus types of persons. The primary function of the Hiri, however, is to identify the essential ideas within various kinds of suttas. Having identified the type of sutta and its application to persons, the interpreter would employ these categories to penetrate to the essence of the sutta by correlating the sutta's phraseology with the central concepts of the Dhamma. Conclusion. To conclude, we can summarize the main points in our analysis of the neti and the Pithakopadesa. These Tabewo texts represent manuals of interpretation which present methods for the correct understanding of the Dhamma. Central to these methods is the concept of the gradual path to Nibbana as a hermeneutical device or strategy to explain the logic and the structure of the Dhamma. The gradual path provides a framework that permits the Dhamma to have both great diversity and an underlying unity. The neti and the Pithakopadesa demonstrate the diversity of the Dhamma by identifying various types of suttas that have relevance to various types of persons on various levels. With almost infinite variations, these combinations of types of suttas and types of persons constitute an immensely long gradual path to the goal of Nibbana. This notion of the path links all the diverse persons, stages, and goals. Although these manuals define some suttas as mundane and others as supramundane, and though they identify some suttas as applying to ordinary persons and others as applying to adepts, the manuals do not regard these as distinct religious paths. They do not separate the kamic from the nibbanic path. Though the path has many levels and applications, the Dhamma is one and the path is one. This, the neti shows, is the secret to understanding the logic and meaning of the Buddha's teachings. The manuals demonstrate the unity underlying the diversity in many ways. The diverse types of suttas can be reduced to two types, seen either as mundane and supramundane, or as dealing with morality or penetration. All suttas represent parallel expressions of the truth of the Dhamma, while their diversity reflects the diverse needs and contexts of persons. Similarly, the almost countless stages or levels of the path can all be reduced to three levels: ordinary person, learner, and adept. The two main interpretive categories of the neti and the Petakopadesa, the nayi and the hiri, serve to indicate how the interpreter can find the unity of essential truth in the diversity of the Dhamma. This implicit unity is such that if a person understands one sutta well, he understands the whole truth of the Dhamma. This principle applies both to the interpreters of the Dhamma, whom these manuals intend to instruct, and to the person striving at the various levels of the path. The neti and the Takopadesa attribute the dividing of the Dhamma into these diverse levels and the arranging of them along the gradual path to Nibbana to the Buddha himself. The Petakopadesa states that the suttas were broken up according to meaning and phrasing and divided according to application by the Buddha, and it is the interpreter's task to restore their original unity. Page 80. If, however, contexts generate texts so that texts represent social facts, as we have noted above, then it seems probable that this elaborate division of the Dhamma and the structuring of it along a gradual path grew out of the context in which the neti and the Petakopadesa were written, that is, the later Theravada tradition in India. To be sure, as an enlightened teacher, the Buddha doubtless adjusted his teachings to suit the needs of the various people he met. The Pali Suttas, for example, contain a great variety of teachings on various levels. It remained, however, for followers of the Buddha, such as the authors of the Neti and the Takopadesa, to arrange and categorize these various Dhamma teachings according to the logic of development. In the clash of religious contexts that Dumont and Poussin describe, these texts had to clarify the nature of the path and the roles of the renouncers and the men in the world, here identified as learners/adepts and ordinary persons. These manuals accept all these forms of religious practice and spiritual development, and link them together via the gradual path. The gradual path provides for the kind of hierarchical religion needed in the context of the man in the world, while also providing for the individualistic discipline and cosmology required by the adept. Thus, although the neti and the Petakopadesa attempt to recontextualize this understanding of the gradual path by attributing it to the Buddha, the conception of the Dhamma and its interpretation they present seem to reveal, in large part, a later context, in which Theravada was wrestling with the question of how to give the Dhamma an inclusive interpretation without sacrificing its true intention. Finally, finding this inclusive interpretation of the path spelled out in these early Theravada works is significant because it documents both the antiquity and the legitimacy of the layperson's role in the Theravada tradition. Although it might seem that merit-making represented a later development among Theravadins in Sri Lanka or Burma, these texts indicate that the tradition has long regarded the gradual path to be central and has understood merit-making to be an integral stage of that path. Contrary to Weber's views, early Theravada, according to the Neti and the Petakopadesa, did have something to offer to the householders who remained in the world.